He is an economist who knows no boundaries.
Well, Al, of course, is known all over the world.
Every country. I can't think of one that he hasn't been to.
Panama's interesting. Get to India, Cyprus, and we went into Indonesia, to Chile and Thailand. Now this last trip was to Azerbaijan.
Consulting with academic colleagues, ministers of finance, and world leaders, he gives economic advice, project evaluations, and social evaluations on a myriad of subjects.
It isn't a dismal science. It's a science that helps you learn things and do things creatively.
We Chileans always have nicknames for everyone, you know, and Arnold Harberger became Alito.
During a storied teaching career at Johns Hopkins, MIT, the University of Chicago, and UCLA, his global missions have also been in demand for over 50 years. His work has had an economic impact on nearly every continent.
People who have all sorts of different political backgrounds and political ideas, they trust Alito's good intentions and very good economics.
He should be given a Nobel Prize because of the impact he has had in improving the welfare of the poor in the world.
Currently, he is Chief Economic Advisor for the U.S. Agency for International Development, among other things. And at 83, Al Harberger is still a hard guy to catch up with, as we did in January of 2008. Interviewed by Richard Lanham, Professor Emeritus of English at UCLA, and at his home in Bell Canyon, north of Los Angeles, this is A Conversation with Arnold Harberger.
Al, you said once when we were discussing your career that you looked upon it as a great adventure. You've traveled all over the world, you've worked all over the world, and you're still doing it. I thought that your first consulting job was with the International Monetary Fund in 1950.
That's right.
I thought it might be fun to begin with your last adventure. The last email I got from you was from Azerbaijan.
Well, since June of about a year ago, I have had a part-time task as Chief Economic Advisor of the United States Foreign Aid Program. I made a stipulation that I didn't want to go to any country for less than 2 weeks because all my life I have really hated the whole idea and the whole crowd of instant experts, the people who come off an airplane and they have a solution to all the country's problems in their back pocket, and they give lectures to everybody around saying how their solution is what everybody should adopt. And certainly this is totally insensitive to what the people in the country might think. But I think it's also bad science, that one really should be on the spot and learn something about a country before shooting one's mouth off. I had previously in this AID operation done my 2 weeks in Colombia, in Paraguay, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, and now this last trip was to Azerbaijan, where I appeared in Baku. Now, I had never been to that part of the world, and my vision of that part of the world was this was the ancient Silk Road over which the camels traveled back and forth in olden times. So I get to Baku and I find a city of 4 million people with its roads clogged with Mercedes and BMWs and Toyotas and whatnot, and with traffic problems that rival those of most big cities in the world, and it seems to be more particularly in the developing world, that the developing world has moved ahead so fast that their roads aren't built to be able to cope with the great upward movement of the stock of cars. And then another impression was that the people in the ministries, I went to about 4 or 5 different ministries. I went to the central bank a few times, saw the president of the central bank, saw the research staff of the central bank. And I give them a very good grade for their degree of professionalism and sophistication. The oil boom that that country is undergoing is kind of unbelievable. That huge skyrocketing of the price of oil had no precedent before, and really dominated the scene. And then after that, we went to Cyprus, where my colleague and collaborator, Glenn Jenkins, works part of the time in Eastern Mediterranean University.
Would you like to talk a little bit about your work in project evaluation with him?
The two of us, Glenn and I, were contracted to do what we call the national parameters for a bridge across the Rio de la Plata between Argentina and Uruguay back around 98 or thereabouts. The so-called national parameters are what is the right discount rate to use in the cost-benefit analysis, A, for Argentina, B, for Uruguay. What can be said about how well the prevailing exchange rate reflects the true cost of foreign exchange? And what about the labor factor and so on in the both countries? That was our task. In the process of this, we discovered something that had simply not been there in literature up to that time. The idea that foreign exchange could have a value to a country that is different from the market exchange rate, I think is easily understood when you realize that most countries have tariffs and other taxes and subsidies affecting imports, exports, and tradable goods in general. So if somebody goes into the market and buys foreign exchange, that tends to displace imports and stimulate exports, and in the process generate a whole slew of external effects of these taxes and subsidies. And because of the high value-added taxes in those two countries, we had to make a special detour, so to speak, to deal with those value-added taxes. And in the process of that, we kind of kicked over a stone, and there was a swarm of snakes underneath. And basically, that part of project evaluation had to be rewritten, so that now there is a parallelism that when you're spending money on tradable goods, you have to deal with this opportunity cost of foreign exchange. But when you spend on non-tradable goods, there's a corresponding way of dealing with the tax and other distortions that are there. And that is something that up to that time had been neglected.
So that's an instance of what you've dwelt throughout your career, which is that local conditions change how you think.
And the interesting thing is that this is not just applicable to Argentina and Uruguay, it's not just applicable to countries with value-added taxes, it's a generally applicable thing. And I get such a kick out of it because if you do serious professional work and you're getting down there, you're getting your hands dirty, you run into a problem and you have to deal with that problem, and all of a sudden you're discovering something, bang, like that.
Al Harberger, first and foremost, is a professional economist, an extraordinarily good one. And in all the work he's done, he always tries to get the economics of it straight, so that as he's helpful to governments and aid agencies or anybody else that comes along, and he has this knack of being helpful, nevertheless, he's respected because of the integrity of trying to get the economics straight.
Well, I think that Alito has made enormous contributions to economic theory. He's made contributions in international trade, in public finance, which is his field of specialization, and in welfare economics, especially in a branch which is project evaluation.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what project evaluation really is for
well,
us non-economists.
its other name is benefit cost analysis, and what it amounts to is trying to weigh in advance the benefits and the costs of public expenditures. And it differs from what a businessman ordinarily does, because the businessman evaluates an investment or another action in terms of how much net profit that will yield to the business. Whereas in project evaluation, we consider other possible gainers or losers in that act, and ideally at least we think of looking at benefits and costs from the standpoint of the society as a whole. We followed a different path of just putting ourselves in the grand tradition of good economics, starting from Adam Smith and going to Ricardo, Mill, Marshall, Mead, and so on. They haven't been contributions that emerged from sitting in a study and saying, you know, how can I create a differentiated product? They're contributions that arose out of coping with real problems on the spot.
In 1987, you wrote, and this is an extraordinary quotation, "I do not really prize originality in the same way that I prize professionalism." And I wonder if you'd like to expatiate a little on what you mean by professionalism.
Well, I think economics is a twin in some sense of medicine, in the sense that it has scientists like medical science and so on, and it has practitioners like the doctors and surgeons that we go to. And economics is also like that, that we have economists who develop theories and so on in universities and whatnot. And then we have those people who work in ministries and central banks and our cabinet departments in the United States, in the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and all of that. And they are there dedicating themselves to coping with real-world problems all the time. One of the reasons why I keep teaching at my age is that, by God, I want to make sure that people coming out of UCLA have some of this that I value so highly.
While teaching at the University of Chicago in 1955, Harberger became intimately involved in a program bringing talented students from the Catholic University in Santiago, Chile, to Chicago.
When I first met Al was back in the 50s, when I became a member of the faculty at the University of Chicago. And by that time, the interaction of the university's economics department with the Chilean Catholic University was getting underway. And we had these very gifted people coming from Chile to study PhD level economics. And Al was kind of their godfather.
Oh, well, he's an extraordinary teacher. He never says, you are wrong because. He says, you are right, but there's another slant to the thing, you know. Let's see, and he asks questions, he puts figures, and he very soon transforms that person into a pupil, a student, and people react very well to that.
Alito has always been such a good technician, you know, doing away with politics, you know, just being very straight and sometimes very politically incorrect.
One thing in which Alito and Chicago were very important was in producing evidence that demonstrated that education was an activity where investments should be increased importantly. And Alito made some studies in 1965 in India, and he produced rates of return to investment in human beings, which was very, very high. And I think that that was also the case for Chile.
I made several trips to South America when I was Secretary of the Treasury, and of course others when I was Secretary of State. But knowing Al Harberger as I did from my Chicago days, I invited him to come with me because I knew he understood these countries. He was known in the countries and would be giving me good advice.
The most controversial of your adventures was the adventure in Chile. Want to just try to tell that story your way from the beginning?
Well, first of all, we had our program from 56 to 64. That was where we really started our linkage.
This would have been with the Catholic University in Chicago.
This is with the Catholic University and so on. Well, I kept going to Chile, in particular with AID. I was there working from 62 onwards up to 1970. And some very interesting work with the central bank and the Ministry of Finance and so on under AID auspices. And I continued to come with AID during part of the Allende period, 70 to 73. Tariffs, by the way, under Allende went up to maybe 400%, many over 100%, an average around 80%. Toward the end of the Allende regime, there were, I think, 12 or 13 official exchange rates, the lowest of which was 25 escudos per dollar, and the highest of which was 1,325 escudos per dollar. And the black market was over 2,000 escudos per dollar. You can see what a crazy economy that was. They kept the price of bread so low, feeding it with imported wheat, that pig farmers would buy bread to feed to their pigs. It was a crazy, crazy economy with a lot of shortages, a lot of rationing, a lot of favoritism, the people who got real access to the cheap things that were rationed by black markets for meat, for example. They didn't say 20% premium, 30% premium over the official price. It was 5 times the official price, 7 times the official price, multiples rather than percentages, so to speak. And there was a general revolt in Chile against this crazy, almost comic opera. And then in September of 1973 came the military coup, and the military government came in. And I don't think there's any doubt that the majority of the Chilean people welcomed the military coup when it came.
Amid this economic scenario, Socialist President Salvador Allende named Augusto Pinochet Commander-in-Chief of the Chilean Army in August 1973. 3 weeks later, on September 11th, Pinochet's coup ousted Allende, who shot himself.
If you read Chilean history right, it was Congress in August of 73 that almost called the military to step in and put an end to the chaos.
And when there was the change of government there and Pinochet became the head of government, the economy was in chaos. So we had a meeting with him. It was somewhat controversial, but we talked about economics, and I don't think he particularly knew anything about it and sort of said, does anybody know how to run an economy? And these people that Al and others at Chicago, Milton Friedman, had trained, held up their hands and said, we know how to run one. And so they put into effect the only reasonably free market economy in South America.
So this group became basically undersecretaries in the different departments of the government, and many reforms were made.
When we came in 1973 as advisors to the military government, inflation was more than 1,000%. GMP was not growing at all. We decided that we would change that, and we lowered tariffs from the highest tariffs were 900%, import prohibitions were abundant. And we changed that, and we lowered taxes to 10%, import taxes. And this was a great revolution, because the lower import taxes meant that raw materials could be imported at lower prices. And as a consequence of that, I think that the productive resources in the country got allotted much better than they were being allotted before, and income started growing very, very rapidly.
Pinochet was named president of Chile by his own military junta in 1974 and held that post until the return of civilian rule in 1990.
Al, the center of your Chile adventure was that 1975 trip with Milton Friedman, and that's what caused much of the fuss.
Yeah, a foundation run by a former student of ours, Ralph Luders, invited Milton Friedman to come down and give a series of talks in Chile. And I was invited to partake of that same mission, and also another former student, Carlos Langoni, from Brazil, who later became president of Brazil's central bank. We gave panel presentations and individual talks and things like that. Milton, by the way, gave a number of presentations in which he was lauding political freedom and saying that one of his great convictions, which it really was that the greater the economic freedom, the more the door was being opened, the path was being opened to political freedom. So as part of that visit, we were invited as a trio to see Pinochet. Langoni and I, as I remember, didn't say a word, but Friedman talked quite a lot, and it may be that his voice helped to reinforce the recommendations that were being made by the Chicago boys all along. I mean, it wasn't, he didn't recommend anything new in that ambience. We spent at best 1 hour with Pinochet and went away. Well, Milton came back after that week to face like 3 years worth of demonstrations against him. Almost every lecture that he gave, including when he won the Nobel Prize, there were demonstrations against him at the Nobel Prize thing. The demonstrations against me at Harvard were the worst when I had an offer from Harvard to head HIID.
Could you tell people what HIID?
Harvard Institute for International Development. Yeah, people just had the wrong idea about either of our presentation, of our links, so to speak, with the military government. What
was your putative offense? What did they think Milton Friedman had done? Conspired with the fascist oppressor to?
Sort of. I mean, the idea that we were kind of hand in glove with black popes behind this government, and in some sense exuding support for the government. And here I was trying to keep myself as far away as possible, and Milton was making speeches about the economic liberty leading to political liberty, in no way trying to endorse or support the military government. Chile had a tradition of democracy. The Chilean military were, at least in a considerable measure, reluctant organizers of
the economy.
They felt they had to defend Chile against what was really becoming a strong, almost Soviet-type economy. They sponsored the transition to the democracy that we see in Chile today, and there is no doubt that Chile's democracy has flourished in these past 4 presidential elections. And the thing that I feel so happy about is that the economic policy, which was the product of my students and others, and was so successful that even though many of the members of the Chilean opposition railed against aspects of economic policy while they were in opposition, when they got into government, they bought 97, 98, 99% of it, and have reinforced and strengthened it more than they have torn it down.
That includes the current...
Up to and including right now.
And now Chile is an open political as well as economic system. And I think the work that Al did and the Chicago boys did helped to bring that about, because the openness of the economy kind of led people, of course, to want more and more and more an open political system.
We had a dictatorship, and we had a very free economy, and the thing evolved, and today we are in democracy. This has not happened in Cuba, and this has not happened in North Korea. This has not happened in the other places where you have dictatorships. And it will probably happen in Cuba after, it is happening today really, because Castro is not in real hold of things, and his brother is opening it up. And it will happen in China, I am sure, because of freedom in economics.
I used to write papers for a think tank called the Center for Public Studies. And once Sergio de Castro, who was Minister of Finance, wanted the message of a certain paper to get through to the military. They wanted to have a special program of tax incentives to favor the extreme north and extreme south of the country. And my paper concerned the experience of Brazil with their special taxation in favor of Amazonia and the Northeast. And my paper showed, I thought very conclusively, how terrible was the Brazilian program. And it was precisely the Brazilian program that the military were trying to imitate. So de Castro took me to Pinochet with a half an hour to interview to explain to him the content of this paper. But we got into that office, and all he did was spend the whole hour praising de Castro for all the good work that he had done, and saying, I want to thank you as a professor and so on and so on for having had an involvement with him. So I didn't get a word in edgewise about my own paper.
I see.
Well, yes, I do remember, and actually the economy was growing very, very rapidly at that time, and inflation was coming down also very rapidly. So the government was very happy by the way things were going.
And that was the last time I saw Pinochet. Now contrast with that with the very statesman-like Christian Democratic president Eduardo Frei, who became a fairly good personal friend during the Allende years. We had him dancing the cueca downstairs in our house in Chicago, and we had dinner at his house a couple of times. I would go to his office to see him, where we really did talk. So he is the president of Chile that I really talked to.
I see.
Both before the military government and during the military government, under the sharp eyes of the DINA, the secret police, probably. That's kind of the true story of Harberger's nefarious involvement with Pinochet.
At Harberger's home, Richard Lanham continued to explore Harberger's global work.
You spent a year in India, 1961 to 62. Tell us about that.
That was interesting. And the link was with the Planning Commission of India. And I was there with Dick Eckes, Per Seveldsen from Norway, and Nino Andreatta from Italy, who later became a minister in Italy, and was a co-author with me of an article on electricity pricing while we were there. As I remember it, one of my first papers was on measuring the real rate of return to capital in the private sector of the Indian economy, which is a key variable in helping to determine the right discount rate to use in cost-benefit analysis.
Harberger notes how the selection of information in economic analysis can affect on-the-ground policy decisions.
The Planning Commission came to me and wanted me to do something in connection with the investment in highways. They sort of gave me this task, and so I said, well, somebody should get me the progress reports of the transport ministry or agency. So they brought me a whole sequence of reports. On the first or second page of all of these reports, there were tables. I mean, repeated. Every year they repeated these tables. And the first one would say, number of miles of paved road per square mile of area. The number of miles of paved road per population. But always India was at the bottom. And the subliminal message was, give us more money so we can get up to the top, you see. So the first thing that I did was to generate a table on number of miles of paved road per motorized vehicle. Guess what? India, right there. Now, to justify projects in highway construction and improvement, it's the traffic that is the key in
I see.
So
Okay.
the vehicle
Right.
one is clearly the, quote, right one to use. And it's an example of sort of the way, to me, the way the world works, you know. You're never going to change human nature. You're never going to change motivations that way. And whether or not there are enough paved roads, it's very likely that the authority that runs that business is always going to want more money.
Sure.
And that was a simple example of that.
Do you want to tell us something about some of the places you worked? Maybe Panama is a place to start?
Well, Panama is interesting because there was a period from about 1961 to 1977 where the head of planning was one former student of mine or another for all but, I think, 11 days.
No wonder the Justice Department didn't get you in for monopolistic practices.
The person that was most involved in my work in Panama was Nicolás Ardito Barletta, who had been director, then director general, then minister, before he went to the World Bank as vice president for Latin America. That was his trajectory. Then he came back to Panama to become president of the Republic. And then he was kicked out by Noriega.
Okay.
So it was quite a thing. There were something like 7 years there where either I or I, helped by one or two Panamanians, did the national projections of budget receipts and expenditures of the Panamanian government every single year. And for at least 3 or 4 of those years, I did that all alone.
Good grief.
And what I say about that is that's where I paid my professional dues. You have to make these projections, you have to make them in a certain amount of time, you're going to make mistakes. Do you learn from your mistakes? Are you willing to go back and look at last year and find out what you did wrong and why you did wrong, and so on? It's really quite an exercise, and it is not built for people with excessively large egos, you know.
I've been teaching in South America for a long time, and in Panama they thought I was great. And so they asked me to do this social evaluation of the widening of the Panama Canal. And I said, okay, but I was a bit scared. So what I called Al, I said, Alito, will you please come with me? And it was fun.
We were called in as consultants on the widening of the Panama Canal. And the reason why they wanted us to do that was because they had to submit this whole issue of should we not build this third set of locks in the canal, should we not do that, had to be submitted to a plebiscite.
What we did was turn prices, which are market prices, into national prices, to social prices. When you do an evaluation of a project, what you do is you see how does this project enhance the wealth of the owner of the project. When you do a national or a social evaluation, you say how does this project enhance the wealth of the country? How does this affect the Panamanian economy? And we changed the domestic, the market prices into social prices, and so the multiplier effects the canal had on Panamanian society.
After Ernesto Fontaine and Al Harberger's study, construction of a third channel on the Panama Canal began in 2007. Scheduled for completion in 2014, the price of the project is expected to be recovered within 10 years, while creating 15% more jobs for the people of Panama.
I know you worked in Argentina in the 60s. I've always had trouble understanding the tergiversations of that country. What do you think is happening there now?
Well, you're not the only one. I mean, Argentina is something of a mystery because in the early 1900s it was one of the half-dozen richest countries in the world. Yes. Mm-hmm. And so it really underwent at least a very significant relative retrogression. Yes. During this period. In Argentina later, in the 90s, they had a pretty good spell in the 90s in which we had graduates of our Chicago program as being ministers and being central bank presidents and so on. And I am proud of what they did, led, by the way, by somebody from Harvard, Domingo Cavallo, during part of that time. Yes. And I want to give that Harvard boy due credit. Roque Fernandez is one of ours, and he succeeded Cavallo as minister, and he had been central bank president, and he was succeeded by Pedro Poe, who was another one of ours. And then we had people as Secretary of Finance and so on, Secretary of the Treasury. So our Chicago people were quite active in that successful period in Argentina.
Well, there seem to be populist revolts, maybe, or revivals in Bolivia and Venezuela, certainly, maybe Argentina a little bit. Do you think that, how's that going to play out?
Well, my prediction is that there are some snakes that no matter how many times you chop off their heads, they seem to regrow them and they come up and bite you again. Protectionism is one that we see in economics all the time. That we keep killing it and it keeps reviving. And I think that populism is like that too. And my definition of populism, it isn't just something that's good for the poor. I think there are many good things that you can do that are good for the poor and that really help. But populism is giving the poor something that sounds real good, but on which you're really unable to deliver. And I think that the populist governments that you mentioned in Venezuela and Bolivia are likely to be falling into that trap of populism where they're just not going to be able to deliver what they promise, and the end result will be the people foregoing an economic growth that they could have had. One of the things that I like about recent history is that maybe starting with Felipe Gonzalez in Spain, going to Bob Hawke in Australia, going to Ricardo Lagos in Chile, Tony Blair in England, and so on, Helmut Schmidt in Germany, that you have left-wing governments that embrace reasonably good or very good economics. And I think it's so great to have good economics on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, in a country.
Let me say something. I don't know how many students I've had who have said, Professor Lanham, I would like to do something with my life that does good in the world, that's exciting, and that caused me to travel a lot. And now I would say to them, have I got the job for you? Be an economist.
I think I was particularly lucky, you know. Not many economists have as much luck as I have had in this respect, to be able to move like in a picaresque novel from
It's exactly like a picaresque
adventure to adventure to adventure.
Right.
But I think the people who work for the IMF are a bit like that. So these former students are those who are coming closest to the adventuresome life that I have had. They go on missions to here, there, and everywhere, see economic policy from different points of view. One of the great contributions of both the fund and the World Bank are that people from developing countries who spend a 15, sometimes 20, sometimes 10-year apprenticeship there, you know, learning real professional economics, they go back to their countries and they become finance ministers, they become the president of the central bank and so on. And they bring with them richness of experience and accumulated judgment and wisdom that was never there before and would be very hard to replicate. So I do think that if you're going to advise one of your students to become an economist and have an adventuresome life, probably the fund and the bank or the regional development banks or AID maybe are the best place to go.
What about some of your work for the AID? You're now the principal consulting economist for...
No, Chief Economic Advisor
I'm sorry, Chief
title.
Economic Advisor. Okay. What does that mean for you, other than you get sent to all these neat places?
Half the time that I work for AID, I do so in Washington, and the other half in these different missions to the countries.
Well, when I was Secretary of State, I would get memoranda that dealt with economic subjects. And there were lots of people there who were gifted and knowledgeable about various aspects of economics as we were dealing with it. But they weren't economists. They didn't think like an economist.
George Shultz had set up a panel of economists for advice, which included Harberger. After the Reagan administration, Shultz called on Harberger again.
What was the advanced training in economics program? You worked in that for about 10 years, but I don't have a clear idea.
Oh, ATIE, that was an AID finance program that came about indirectly as a result of the initiative of George Shultz when he was leaving as Secretary of State and wanted high probability good things being done with aid money. And so he and Alan Wallace, who was the Deputy Secretary of State, sent messages to Clay LaForce, then dean of our business school here, and me, saying, we would like you to dream up good projects for AID. So I went to work and dreamed up something to follow, to do like we had done with Chile and Argentina and so on. And we dreamed up the idea of me picking 4 Latin American universities that I thought would give good programs. And we would send people for 2 years, more or less, of study in those places.
I see.
And maybe subsequently come to the United States and maybe not.
I see.
So the ATIE program was formed. Maybe 150 to 200 were trained under this program during the period that it lasted in Latin America. And maybe another 30 or 40 did PhD level work in the US. And it was a very successful program, and the people went back, and some of them went into very high posts.
If I asked you at lunch, as I did once early in our acquaintance, what exactly is your field? You said public finance. I didn't quite understand what it was.
It deals with the tax and expenditure sides of government. Cost-benefit analysis, applied welfare economics, the stuff I do in project evaluation, that's all mostly on the expenditure side. But there's a great deal of analysis of taxes, and you can have taxes that are utterly noxious, and you can have other ones which are quite benign, never totally benign. And you can certainly greatly improve a tax system, of which there has been a great improvement in the whole world over the last 30, 40, 50 years. People don't realize that coming out of the Second World War, the highest U.S. marginal tax rate was 91%. Then it went to 70%. It stayed at 70% until the Nixon administration, when it was knocked down to 50%, but just for labor income. On capital income, it stayed at 70% until the Reagan administration, when it was knocked down to 50%. That rate is now 35%, the maximum rate. So you can see other countries around the world, developed and developing countries, have more or less moved their top rates down in sympathy with what was happening in the United States and maybe ahead of it. So these are improvements in the tax system. And I think economic analysis has helped a lot in bringing that about. I keep saying that we in economics have an overall responsibility. Somehow the profession as a whole has the responsibility of bringing to the public decision-making process the lessons of economic science, the stuff that's relevant that we have to bring to that table. And I think it is unfortunate if we sort of abjure that responsibility and don't bring this message to the table. And I think it's also unfortunate if we come to the table with such an imperialistic vision that we want to be the advisors on economics, sociology, morals, and everything else. I think let's be professionals. You see, this is part of the whole, that word professional keeps coming up in my stuff because I believe so firmly that this is our stock in trade. This is what we really do have to offer. And what we ought to do, and what we do in public finance, and what I try to do, is, by God, offer it. You know?
And train hundreds of other people
to
to
make it available. Just the feeling of things are better because you were there, because this group was able to do something and convince people of something. And my feeling in economics is that we economists are, guess what, professionals. and that most of the people that take the decisions, be they ministers, central bank people, legislators, or whatnot, are not economists. So the only way that you're going to succeed in this game of bringing the results of professional economics into public policy is by convincing these people.
So
to do so, you have to talk in a language they understand. And you have to give them an underlying feeling, a good intuition of what economic principles are all about and why a particular set of moves is sensible or better than another one.
As noted earlier, Harberger's work in public finance involves analysis of welfare economics. He addresses the topic now in more detail.
What is nice about applied welfare economics, in a certain sense cost-benefit analysis generally, there's demand price, there's supply price, and then the other postulate that we have is adding up. We add up these benefits and costs across different individuals in the society. Okay, these three simple principles can lead to the benefits of free trade, how you set a tax system to be, how you choose between two systems, which is the lesser evil of the two, so to speak, how you do a cost-benefit analysis of a bridge across the Rio de la Plata, how you set those national parameters, which Jenkins and I had to do for Argentina and Chile, why monopoly is bad, how discriminating monopoly works, what the best arguments and the worst arguments for tariffs are. All of this, the standard conclusions of a great range of economics, can flow like the Niagara River from those simple postulates. And I think that if you mix this great respect for the power of those simple postulates with the genuine humility that I talked about earlier, that you have to realize that injustices are going to happen and that things that you would love to be able to avoid are inevitably going to be there. And your job is to try to minimize those costs. I think that's a big piece of the story of what we applied economists try to do in our linkage to public policy.
The University of Chicago has an unusual energy. Everybody there is a student. Some are called faculty members, some are called students, but everybody's there because they enjoy learning and they challenge each other. It was a thriving place. The instruction is excellent, and in economics, Al Harberger is one of the key people.
There's a recent book on called The Chicago School that begins this way: if Adam Smith is the father of that dismal science called economics, then Chicago is arguably its capital. And you were a central figure there in the great days. Did 2 tours of duty as chairman from 64 to 71 and 75 to 80. It's a very interesting department.
There was, I think, a Chicago school, and I think that that Chicago school was based on a few simple principles. The first is that the world being as complicated as it is, if we seek by theory to enhance our appreciation and understanding of how the world works, we need theory. And theory must oversimplify. It cannot but oversimplify. Otherwise, the world is just too complicated and we'll never get anywhere. There's a deep dedication to the use of theory in the Chicago school. The second principle was that the theory isn't really very good if it's isolated from real-world observations, that the essence of science is to confront theory with facts and maybe even our being able to foresee how the world will respond in one way or another to a given disturbance. So that's the second principle of the Chicago School. And the third one is, when in doubt, assume that markets work. And one of my own mantras is, good functioning competitive markets lead to a good result in economics. And that has been part of economic theory since Adam Smith. But the idea that markets make everybody happier, that there are no losers in the game, I call it Pollyanna economics. It's not the real world, and anybody who sees what's happening to different groups at different times should understand that there are winners and losers. But what I have to say about that is that market forces are forces, like the wind and the tides, and that they are things that you have to recognize as being there, take into account, live with those forces and take advantage of those forces rather than trying to defy them. Countries get into terrible trouble when they try to stand and blow against the wind of economic forces. On the other hand, when they harness that wind, things come out so much better for them.
UCLA, when you came here, you first came in 1982, was sometimes thought of as a West Coast Chicago. Did you find it so? What kind of department did you attracted you here?
Chicago had this reputation as a market-oriented department, and certainly UCLA had that aspect at that time. Alchian and Demsetz were two key figures in that story, but there were certainly others, Bob Clower, Axel Leyenhoff, and younger people. Sebastian Edwards was a young assistant professor at that time. It was very definitely in the same spirit as Chicago. I would say probably people like Alchian were key, Hirschleifer were key in maintaining this thing.
Arnold Harberger was born in 1924 and grew up with his extended family in Irvington, New Jersey. At his home in Los Angeles, he talked about his early life.
Al, now that we're here in your beautiful house in Bell Canyon and not at UCLA, maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about your family origins and about your family.
We were brought up as Methodists. My father was the organist, the choir director, the superintendent of the Sunday school. My grandfather had been superintendent of the Sunday school before that. My mother was superintendent of the primary Sunday school. And needless to say, we had a certain moral code kind of instilled into us, and but it wasn't a kind of a rigid puritanical type of religion. There was a great deal of love and generosity in the household. And my brother and I, to this day, when we get together, we talk about our upbringing and how lucky we were to have these parents and these grandparents and so on, and to grow up where we did.
Harberger's family instilled in him an engagement with others that would become a hallmark of his style.
Compared with what you see today, it was amazing. I mean, we weren't told don't talk to strangers and things like that. Well, it's perfectly reasonable to be nice to strangers. Right. And when I got to Johns Hopkins in 1941, it was like, being the whole world opening before you and learning about so many things I hadn't learned about before. I took 7 courses at a time when I went through Hopkins, and ended up taking 10 courses the last semester I was there, which I didn't finish because of the Army.
Just short of graduation from Johns Hopkins, Harberger's studies were interrupted when he was drafted into the Army during World War II.
When you were going to language school in the Army, somewhere in your work, you say that you wrote a paper on latifundios in Spain, which would seem to be addressing this problem of inequality in income. Do you remember what you said in that paper?
No, that's the truth.
Well,
but the story is an interesting one. I had taken Spanish in high school, choosing Spanish because I was in a classical curriculum where I had to take 3 years or 4 years of Latin. Mm-hmm. And Spanish looked easy to me as a parallel language. And I learned Spanish pretty well. I took a course in my first year in college, did well, took a reading course over the summer, and then in the fall I was in a graduate course with a great Spanish poet, Pedro Salinas, until I got drafted into the Army. They gave a battery of tests out of which I emerged as a Spanish linguist. And I was sent to the University of Illinois, where all of us, Romanians, Bulgarians, Hungarians, Poles, Germans, everybody were there as a pool that they could draw on, and they did. People would disappear in the middle of the night. 5 weeks later, be dropping in parachutes behind enemy lines and things like that. Everybody in the pool was writing something like a master's thesis, of which mine was on the latifundia in Spain. And I think this was not, there was no true purpose, no intelligence agency was going to read my thesis and make policy on that basis. But this was there to have me familiar with the Spanish economy. The thought was that Franco might come into the war on the German side, or alternatively that we might choose to invade Europe through Spain.
I see. Okay.
Neither of these things happened, so it was a frustrated effort on their part. So one day the colonel calls me in and says, you went to Johns Hopkins University? And I said, yeah. Did you take any languages other than Spanish? I said, yes. What did you take? German. How long did you take German? 1 year. What grade did you get? A. Starting tomorrow, you're a German linguist. So tomorrow, the very next day, I went by train to Camp Ellis, Illinois, where I reported to another colonel who said, oh, you're the new German linguist. You're in charge of Company 12 of prisoners of war. You go through that double barbed wire fence, you turn to your right, you go down to the southwest corner, you find an orderly room there, and in the orderly room you should find Oberfeldwebel Schnellbecher and Unteroffizier Knirr, all of which I did. And they started out standing up in this German kind of salutation and said, Guten Morgen, Herr Harberger. And that's where my education in barracks German began. Finally, we sent the prisoners home, and then I was sent to help audit the books of a prisoner of war camp at Fort Sheridan, Illinois. So that's where my last Army job was auditing the books of Fort Sheridan's prisoner of war camp.
The young Harberger found himself released from the Army in Illinois, months in advance of Johns Hopkins' next semester. Eager to finish his degree, he discovered the nearby University of Chicago was starting a new quarter in just 5 days.
That's the basic reason why I ever went to the University of Chicago, and needless to say, never regretted for a moment that particular piece of luck.
By 1949, Harberger was virtually finished with his Ph.D. at the University of Chicago, and he began teaching as an assistant professor back at Johns Hopkins.
My first semester there, Jack Polak, the head of research at the International Monetary Fund, came in evenings to give a course to the graduate students. I sat in on that course, and Polak took a liking to me and invited me to come to the IMF that summer.
Soon, international economics was beckoning.
The Korean War was on, and materials prices were going through the roof, much worse than now. I mean, they multiplied by 5 and 6 from where they had been. And there was great worry that materials would be the ultimate bottleneck to economic progress and things like that. And President Truman appointed the President's Materials Policy Commission, which was known as the Paley Commission, after Bill Paley, president of CBS, who was its chairman. I got the task of making projections of demand for materials. I mean, not just copper, lead, and zinc, but antimony, bismuth, cobalt, everything, all the way through for the United States and for the free world for the year approximately 1975. It would have been at the time, and even today, very natural for people to make a projection of materials demand, going material by material and fitting some demand equation and then projecting it 25 years into the future. And I had many reasons for not doing that. So the approach that I used was almost to try to create a picture of what the whole U.S. economy would look like. How many households, what kind of a labor force, what kind of productivity, how many automobiles, how many houses, how much automobile building in a year, how much house construction in a year, how much other construction, this, that, and the other thing. So that panorama became the backdrop out of which I sort of plugged in some, quote, natural way, what would be the use of steel, the use of copper, the use of antimony, manganese, and all the rest, compatible with this picture.
Back at the University of Chicago, legendary economist T.W. Schultz, chairman of the Department of Economics, had noticed Harberger's writing.
In one of those leaps that nobody can understand, T.W. Schultz reads Harberger's chapter on projection of materials demand for 1975, 25 years ahead. He reads it and said, "This is our man for public finance." My field was international trade.
You got an
I
MA
was working in projections there, and all of a sudden I get an offer to take over the field of public finance at the University of Chicago on the basis of this chapter, which I was lucky enough to have my name attached to.
In 1955, T.W. Schultz took Harberger to Chile to investigate starting a program in economics between the University of Chicago and the Catholic University in Santiago.
That was another opening of the eyes. I had never seen a foreign economy before, and here I was not only seeing a foreign economy, but one that was kind of crazily distorted, at least from my perspective. I later saw much more distorted economies, but this was a real shock in one sense, but a great experience professionally. So I became enthralled and fascinated by it.
One of the Chilean students greeting the Chicagoans' plane at Santiago was Sergio de Castro.
Well, I met Alito in 1955. I remember it as if it was yesterday. In June 1955, he came with Ted Schultz. And since I spoke English, at least I could be understood. I was named a sort of liaison officer to the group of Americans. And we became very good friends with Alito immediately.
When we went in 55, landing in Los Cerrillos Airport in Santiago, we get off the plane, and there are 2 fifth-year students of the Catholic University Sergio de Castro, who later became the lead minister in the whole liberalization of Chile, and Ernesto Fontaine, who is without doubt the greatest project evaluation economist that Latin America has yet produced.
Well, to show you how good friends are, the things he says about us are exaggerations.
We became friends. They are possibly the best friends that I have in the world. And that friendship really started already then.
Soon, Fontaine and de Castro would find themselves studying for their PhDs at Chicago.
Well, they were in Chicago sharing an apartment with 3 other Chileans. And in this place, they had a party every Saturday night, except at exam time. They worked extremely hard during the week, but this blast occurred every Saturday night.
Every time in the party, the cops would come, and knock our door, to put the music down, too much noise.
Once we heard that a Chilean girl was at Northwestern University, and she was studying education, and she taught Spanish. So we went to see her. And we met her, we liked her, we invited her to our next Saturday party. And Alito came, and it was love at first sight.
They invited me to a party. He was all the student, plus this guy, But what happened was that he was talking Spanish, and he started talking to me.
It went very whirlwind. I left for England before New Year's, and didn't see Anita then until the 15th of March, which was our wedding day, when she arrived by plane in London Heathrow Airport.
We took Anita to the airport with our guitars and whatnot, and bid her goodbye when she went over to marry Alito.
They have a guitar. They were funny. They were really funny.
And we were married in St. Martin in the fields in the afternoon of that day.
And as a wedding present, we gave Alito our car. We were coming back to Chile. An old Mercury, which was in bad shape, but he loved it. That was the present we gave him as a marriage present.
Anita has been traveling the world with Al for 50 years. The couple's first son, Paul, was born in Chile, Carl in India.
Let's return now for a minute to your written work. We might start with real cost reduction.
Well, this comes from the analysis of economic growth. Economists develop a framework for analysis of growth, which basically said, well, you get growth from the labor force increasing. You get growth from the labor force improving its quality and its skills. You get growth from the capital stock increasing. You get growth from the capital stock working at a higher rate of return or rate of productivity. And finally, there's this last term, which in those days they called technical advance. And I, in my work, trying to talk to ordinary people, insist that it is much better to use the term real cost reduction, because that's what it consists of. And real cost reduction is a term that every businessman understands. And more than that, you see, if I talk technical advance, they're thinking of, big modern machines or computerization and stuff like that. But real cost reduction can be straightening out an assembly line, can be improving your personnel procedures, can be so many different things. And the term real cost reduction leads a reader or somebody who's listening to think in this broader terms, which
I
is a
understand.
more correct way to think about the issue.
What about real exchange rate economics? What do you mean by that?
Wow. Well, I should tell you that I did my thesis on the study of the effects of devaluation. A key article is called Currency Depreciation, Income in the Balance of Trade, that came out of my thesis. Then I went to the International Monetary Fund in the summer of '50, and there I worked on an analysis of the effects of the 1949 devaluations over a whole set of countries that were involved in those devaluations at that time. And then when I got to Chile in 1955 and 1956, one of the big things that I observed was this high degree of protectionism in Chile. What is protectionism? Protectionism is cutting off a potential demand for foreign currency, isn't it? So as you cut off the demand for foreign currency, the price of foreign currency falls. And doesn't necessarily fall in nominal pesos or dollars, but it falls in real terms. The dollar becomes cheap in real terms in consequence of the protectionist move. So I was writing about this in the summer of 1956 in Chile. Get to India in 1961-62, they're worse protectionists than Chile. So they have also a problem of a real exchange rate, a real price of the dollar that is too low, a dollar that is too cheap, because they have so heavily restricted the demand for imports. Okay, then I get into, I'm probably missing some, but there was a whole spate of things that in my present recollection started with the Central American coffee boom of the late 60s and 1970s. It has proceeded in a number of places. I was just working in Azerbaijan on the proceeds of an oil boom. In Chile, we've had the issue with respect to copper booms. And in El Salvador, going back into the late 80s and early 90s, when I also was working there, the boom was one of remittances from abroad. We met with different sectors of the economy, and among them with agriculturists, and they complained about this issue, and they were adamant. They said, how can our central bank be so stupid to keep the price of the dollar so low at 5? Why can't we raise that to 8 or 10? If you only did that, we would be in clover. How can the central bank be so stupid? And what I had to try to convince them was that if the central bank were to double the nominal exchange rate, it would not be long before the whole level of prices and costs would double. That the move of a nominal exchange rate is not going to change the real equilibrium of the economy. I said, if you're trying to influence the real exchange rate, you've got to do something with real variables. One piece of advice would be, go to your government and say, you know, the United States is giving aid to the extent of about 5% of GDP in El Salvador. Tell the government, don't take that foreign aid. Then the dollar won't be so abundant and it won't be so cheap. You're getting this flood of money from remittances from Salvadorans abroad. Write them letters. Tell them, please don't send that money. And then the dollar won't be so abundant and it won't be so cheap. But don't come around and say, well, we want the foreign aid and we want all this, and we at the same time want an expensive dollar. So that is précis picture of what some of the things that real exchange rate economics is all about.
Let's now move to perhaps the phrase that you're most famous for, the Harberger Triangle. Now, a recent book which discusses you and the Chicago School said the common denominator in his, that is to say, Harberger's research, was what became known even outside the University of Chicago as the Harberger Triangles. You want to try to explain what a Harberger Triangle is?
Basically, this comes from the analysis of distortions of various kinds in markets. When you have a market equilibrium with no distortions, you have the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, and the price that the demanders pay is what the suppliers get. Clear. When you have a distortion like a tax, the most abundant distortion we have in the world, what you have is that demanders pay $1.20, but suppliers get only $1. Well, obviously that creates a difference between those two and is a distortion. And that distortion has a cost to the economy in the sense that the demander who is willing to pay $1.10 easily got what he wanted when the price was $1 with no distortion. But once that distortion is introduced, the market price is $1.20, but he's not willing to pay that. He's only willing to pay $1.10, so he doesn't buy it. So there's a reduction in quantity taking place as a consequence of this artificial increase in price. Well, you think of a triangle where the reduction in quantity is the base, the artificial increase in price is the altitude, and then there's a hypotenuse along the demand curve. I define a Harberger triangle as you imagine there is no distortion in a given market, and you get a point where supply price equals demand price. Now, you imagine a distortion of 10%, and you get a lower quantity, and you get two different prices, supply and demand price. Then you imagine a 20% distortion, and you get a still lower quantity and a higher demand price and a still lower price. Well, if we connect all of those supply prices and all of those demand prices and take an ending distortion like 40%, there's a triangle.
Okay.
That's a real Harberger.
Okay. That's the clearest explanation I've ever heard you give.
One time we had a graduate student, early 70s, in Chicago named Roger Vaughn, who drew wonderful cartoons of many different professors. And he got out a whole series of them. And one of them we have on our wall in Brentwood, which says, Great Moments in Economics #1. And there is a caricature of me dressed in a Superman-like garb with triangles everywhere on there. And there are some imprisoned people down there. There's Triangle Man. He's the only one who can save us from the great tax ripoff. And then later than that, I got word that in one of the skit parties, they were going to give me an award. To give this, they gave me that thing framed as an award. And we had advance notice on that. And Anita made me a Triangle Man costume, which I put on under my clothes like Clark Kent. And right there in the skit party, when they gave me this award, I ripped off my coat and my shirt and my pants. And there I was in full regalia as Triangle Man.
When I went around the world, I often tried to get Al to come with me, and often he did. So we would go to the Asian Development Bank meeting, and financiers there knew Al Harberger. And we go to Indonesia, we went to Singapore, we went to various places. And I learned a lot from Al Harberger. To some extent, people say, I took Al with me. And there's another way of thinking about it. He took me with him.
He invited me to accompany him on a tour of Latin America, which ended in Chile at the meeting of the Inter-American Development Bank. That was early March or so of 1974. Then later, spring of 1974, there was a meeting of the Asian Development Bank in Kuala Lumpur. Once again, he invited me on that tour, and we went into Indonesia and Thailand and Philippines as well as Kuala Lumpur. That's where it started. Then he became Secretary of State, and there he made me a special ambassador for the inauguration of my student, Nicolás Ardito Barletta, as president of Panama.
Nicky was a good president of Panama. It was hard for him in that political environment. But I thought I couldn't go to that. So I thought, who better than Al Harberger to represent us?
After serving as Secretary of State, George Shultz helped found the Institute for International Studies, naming Harberger to the International Advisory Board. Harberger soon found himself in noted company.
Well, when I came back from being Secretary of State to Stanford, they wanted to have something that was a connection to international developments more. And an institute was started. And one of the things that I did to help them get started was, at the president of Stanford's request, was to form an international advisory committee. And I called in all my chips. I got people who were former heads of government to come. President Ford came, and I got Al Harberger to join that.
So I go to the first meeting, and we are sitting in a kind of a big horseshoe, and we're arranged alphabetically along this horseshoe. To my left is Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. To my right is Lord Howe. Down there on that side is Lee Kuan Yew. A little further on is Paul Volcker, etc. There was Helmut Schmidt. There was Bob Hawke from Australia. I think we had Anatoly Dobrinin come to at least one of
Ambassador to the United States from
those.
Russia.
Yeah, it was a panoply of great figures.
It was a very distinguished group. The discussions were really interesting. And I think it sort of helped get the Institute going. It's now called the Fremont Spogli Institute. It's thriving.
If you look back over the last half century and more, as you can, whether you think liberty has increased in Latin America in the 50-plus years that you've been studying it.
Oh, without a doubt, without a doubt. Almost the standard of Latin America was, if not a military dictator, a so-called strongman. You know, that you would have a strongman president in a lot of countries. And what strongman connoted, I would say, was the jailing of opponents, certainly the arbitrary interference with the business affairs of people that the government didn't like, all that kind of thing. And what we have seen is, in a number of countries, of which Chile is an absolute leader, we see a situation of genuine equality of treatment by government and public authorities generally, allowing criticism in the press, and not only has this increased within particular countries, but the number of countries in which this broader sense of freedom prevails has grown substantially over this period.
Let me ask you a question or two about your own intellectual legacy.
I would love to be remembered in the future as an economist within our time who really saw the urgency, the need to professionalize our discipline, to create the necessary number of people who have the know-how to be able to solve this little problem here, that little problem there, that other thing there. And I see in the tools of our trade right now that we can teach that stuff a great deal better than what our system now does, trying to use economics to really do something important.
Al, this conversation with you has been a privilege and a pleasure, and I thank you for it.
For nearly 60 years, Al Harberger has been bringing his professionalism to a world of economic challenges. Today, his students populate governments worldwide and have included presidents, ministers of finance, International Monetary Fund members, central bank presidents, and 2 Nobel Prize winners. Traveling the globe, he has brought a better understanding of economic principles for governments, international agencies, and for the societies they serve. An ambassador of good economics.
He should be remembered because he's an exceptional human being.
He's a terrific guy. He's fun.
I thank you, Alito, very much for what you've given me. I know that I wouldn't be here had it not been for you, so I'm very, very grateful, Alito.
As part of Liberty Fund's Intellectual Portrait Series, this has been A Conversation with Arnold Harberger.